James Carter sat in the courtroom, his fingers lightly tapping against the polished wooden table in front of him. His lawyer, Mark, leaned in and whispered something about staying calm, but James barely registered the words. His eyes were locked on Lisa, his soon-to-be ex-wife, who sat across from him with her arms folded and a smug expression on her face. She was dressed in a sharp navy blue blazer, her blonde hair pulled back into a tight ponytail, exuding the same confidence she had always carried. The confidence of someone who was sure she had already won. The courtroom was smaller than James had expected. He had never been in one before, never had a reason to. He had spent most of his life avoiding confrontation, keeping his head down, working his job, and trying to be a good husband. But none of that had mattered in the end. Now he was here, in the middle of a divorce trial that had turned nastier than he ever could have imagined. Lisa had hired one of the best divorce lawyers in the city, a man named Daniel Whitmore. James had looked him up after receiving the initial court notice. Whitmore had a reputation for being ruthless, the kind of attorney who thrived on humiliating the opposing party. And so far he was doing exactly that. Mr. Carter, Whitmore's voice cut through James's thoughts. The lawyer stood confidently, holding a stack of neatly organized documents. Would you say that you contributed equally to the household finances during your marriage to my client? James hesitated. He knew this was a trap, but he had no choice but to answer. I contributed in other ways. Lisa and I agreed that. Whitmore smirked, cutting him off. It's a yes or no question, Mr. Carter. Did you contribute equally? James clenched his jaw. No, he admitted. Lisa let out a quiet chuckle, shaking her head, as if this was exactly the point she had been waiting to prove. James felt a familiar sting in his chest. That laugh. It was the same one she had used so many times before. The one she used when she thought he was being naive, foolish, weak. I see, Whitmore continued, flipping through his notes. So, my client was the primary financial provider throughout your marriage? James's lawyer, Mark, finally spoke up. Objection, Your Honor. The way this is being framed is misleading. Mr. Carter's contributions to the marriage were not strictly financial. He managed household responsibilities, supported his wife emotionally, and played an active role in their shared life. The judge, a stern-looking woman in her 60s, adjusted her glasses and turned to Whitmore. Rephrase the question, Mr. Whitmore. Whitmore nodded, unfazed. Of course, Your Honor. He turned back to James. Mr. Carter, during your marriage, did my client, your wife, pay for the majority of your living expenses? James exhaled slowly. Yes. Lisa smirked, glancing at her lawyer as if to say, see? This is easy. James felt his fingers tighten into a fist beneath the table. He hated that look, that condescending amusement she always carried when she felt superior. It reminded him of all the times she had dismissed his efforts, all the times she had acted like she was doing him a favor by staying married to him. Whitmore continued his line of questioning, making James look more and more like a dependent burden rather than an equal partner. He painted a picture of a man who had coasted through marriage while Lisa had worked hard. A man who had taken but never given. James wanted to argue, wanted to explain, but every time he opened his mouth, Whitmore shut him down with another pointed question. Then came the moment that tipped everything over the edge. Mr. Carter, Whitmore said, stepping closer. His voice laced with deliberate condescension. Would you say that my client carried you through your marriage? James's lawyer objected immediately, but the judge allowed the question. James hesitated, his mind racing. He knew what they were trying to do. They wanted to frame him as weak, incompetent, undeserving of anything in the divorce settlement. He knew he should answer carefully, should remain composed. But before he could respond, Lisa laughed. It was a short, sharp laugh, but it cut through the courtroom like a knife. It wasn't just amusement, it was mockery. James's entire body tensed. He turned his head slightly, locking eyes with her. She wasn't even trying to hide it. She was openly enjoying this. In that moment, something inside him snapped. For months, he had been sitting through this divorce with quiet resignation. He had let Lisa and her lawyer paint whatever version of him they wanted, believing that eventually, the truth would come out. But now, looking at her, seeing that smug, satisfied expression, he realized something. She didn't just want to win. She wanted to humiliate him. And James was done letting her. A strange calm settled over him as he reached for the buttons of his shirt. His movements were slow, deliberate. The murmurs in the courtroom quieted as people began to notice. Even Whitmore hesitated, his prepared line of questioning momentarily forgotten. James's lawyer looked at him in confusion. "James, what are you?" But James ignored him. Button by button, he unfastened his shirt, then slipped it off, letting it fall onto the table. The room went completely silent. Every pair of eyes in the courtroom was now on him. Even the judge, who had remained composed through the entire trial, seemed momentarily taken aback. Lisa's smirk faltered. For the first time since the trial began, she looked genuinely uncertain. James stood there shirtless, his chest and torso exposed. And for the first time, the courtroom saw what Lisa had always pretended wasn't there. Scars. Deep, jagged scars ran across his skin, a permanent reminder of the accident that had nearly taken his life years ago. The accident that had changed everything. The murmurs returned, quieter this time. Lisa's lawyer opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. James finally broke the silence. "You want to talk about who carried who?" he said, his voice steady but sharp. "Fine. Let's talk about it." Lisa's face had drained of color, and for the first time in this entire trial, she had nothing to say. The moment James's shirt hit the table, the entire courtroom seemed to freeze in time. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the judge, a woman who had likely seen all kinds of dramatic outbursts in her years on the bench, sat motionless, her gaze fixed on the deep, jagged scars that ran across James's chest and torso. James stood tall, his bare skin exposed under the courtroom's fluorescent lighting. The scars were unmistakable, long, uneven ridges, some fading into his skin, others still prominent, reminders of the accident that had nearly taken his life. The accident Lisa had pretended didn't matter. Lisa's smirk had vanished entirely. Her confident posture had stiffened, her arms still crossed, but now more as a defensive reflex than a sign of dominance. She blinked rapidly, glancing at her lawyer, as if hoping he would break the silence. But even Daniel Whitmore, the ruthless, unshakable attorney, was momentarily at a loss for words. James let the silence linger. He wanted them to feel the weight of it, to sit with the reality they had been so eager to ignore. Slowly, he lifted his gaze, locking eyes with Lisa. He could see the discomfort in her expression, the way she shifted slightly in her seat, the way her fingers twitched as if resisting the urge to smooth her already perfect hair. Then finally he spoke. "You want to talk about who carried who?" His voice was steady, firm. He wasn't yelling. He didn't need to. The weight of his words was enough. "Fine. Let's talk about it." Lisa's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to respond, but she didn't. She just sat there silent like everyone else in the room. James took a deep breath and turned toward the judge, addressing her directly. "Your Honor, for the past hour, I've listened to them paint me as a failure, a burden, a man who contributed nothing to my marriage. They made it sound like I sat back and took advantage of Lisa's hard work, like I gave her nothing in return." He gestured toward his scars. "But this is the truth they left out." The judge's expression remained unreadable, but she didn't interrupt him. She was listening. James turned back toward Lisa and Whitmore. "Do you remember how I got these scars, Lisa?" he asked, his voice quieter now, but no less powerful. "Do you remember the accident?" Lisa didn't respond. James exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "I do. Every single day." He looked back at the judge. 7 years ago, I was in a car accident. It wasn't my fault. Some drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into me at full speed. My ribs were shattered, my left lung collapsed, and my spine took so much damage the doctors weren't sure if I'd ever walk properly again. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even some of the spectators, people who had come to observe an ordinary divorce case, were now fully engaged. "I spent 6 months in the hospital," James continued. "Another year in physical therapy. And do you know who was there for me during that time?" He paused, letting the question hang in the air before answering it himself. "Not Lisa." Lisa's posture stiffened further. She finally opened her mouth. "That's not." James cut her off. "Don't," he said simply. "Don't sit there and pretend you were by my side, because you weren't." Lisa's mouth snapped shut. James turned back to the judge. "She visited me at the hospital a handful of times. But she never stayed long. She hated being around me when I was like that, weak, injured, dependent. She told me it was too hard for her to see me like that. So instead she threw herself into work, into social events, into anything that didn't involve me. Lisa looked away, her jaw tightening. James continued. First, I didn't blame her. I understood that seeing me in that condition wasn't easy. But then when I finally came home, things got worse. I wasn't fully recovered. I still needed help with basic things. I couldn't stand for long periods. I struggled with stairs. I was in constant pain. And Lisa hated it. He turned to look at her again. You remember what you said to me, Lisa? She said nothing. James nodded, as if he hadn't expected her to answer. I didn't sign up for this. Another murmur went through the courtroom. Even Whitmore shifted slightly, as if realizing this was no longer just another divorce case. James clenched his jaw, forcing himself to keep his emotions in check. That's what she told me. After everything we'd been through. After all the years I had supported her in every way I could. The moment I needed her the most, she looked me in the eye and told me she hadn't signed up for a husband who was broken. Lisa finally snapped. That's not fair. She blurted out, her voice rising. James turned to her, his expression unreadable. Not fair. He repeated. Lisa, do you have any idea what it was like to hear that from the person who was supposed to love you unconditionally? Lisa's lips pressed into a thin line. She knew she couldn't take it back. And worse, she knew everyone in the courtroom had heard it. James let out a bitter chuckle. You moved out 6 months later, he continued. Told me you needed space. Said you couldn't handle the stress of being a caretaker. But the truth is, you just didn't want to deal with me when I wasn't convenient for you. Lisa's face was red now, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. But she still didn't say anything. James turned back to the judge. So, Your Honor, when they sit here and try to paint me as a burden, as a man who took and never gave, I want you to remember this moment. Because the truth is, Lisa didn't carry me through our marriage. She abandoned me when I needed her the most. The silence in the courtroom was heavier than before. It wasn't just shock now. It was understanding. Even the judge, who had maintained strict neutrality until this point, seemed to regard Lisa differently. Whitmore cleared his throat, trying to regain control. Your Honor, this is all very emotional, but I fail to see how. The judge held up a hand, silencing him. Then she turned to James. Mr. Carter, she said, her voice calm but firm. You can put your shirt back on. James nodded. He picked up his shirt from the table and slowly pulled it back over his shoulders, buttoning it up with steady hands. The scars were hidden again, but the truth they had revealed remained. As he sat back down, he caught Lisa's expression. She wasn't smirking anymore. She wasn't laughing. For the first time since the trial had started, she looked afraid. The silence that followed James's revelation was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't just a lack of noise. It was thick, suffocating, charged with something heavy and undeniable. The courtroom, once filled with the hum of quiet conversation, shifting papers, and the occasional whisper between attorneys, had become as still as a graveyard. Every pair of eyes was locked onto Lisa, waiting for her to say something, to defend herself, to counter what James had just revealed. But she didn't. She couldn't. James could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers curled slightly on the table in front of her. She wasn't just uncomfortable. She was unraveling. Her once flawless posture, the confidence she had carried like a shield throughout the trial, was beginning to crack. He had known Lisa for a long time, long enough to recognize the signs. She was panicking. The judge adjusted her glasses, looking between the two of them before clearing her throat. Mr. Carter, you've made some serious claims regarding the nature of your marriage and your wife's actions during a difficult time in your life. Miss Carter, do you wish to respond? Lisa's lawyer, Daniel Whitmore, immediately leaned toward her, whispering something in her ear. His face was tight, controlled, but James could see the way his fingers tapped impatiently against the table. He wasn't pleased. This wasn't the direction he had wanted the trial to go, and James knew why. Whitmore thrived on control, on careful narratives that painted his clients as sympathetic victims. But now the entire tone of the case had shifted. Lisa hesitated, glancing at Whitmore before finally speaking. I never abandoned him, she said, her voice quieter than before, lacking the sharpness it had carried earlier in the trial. "That's not what happened." James didn't look away. "Then tell everyone what did happen, Lisa." She swallowed, her lips pressing together in a thin line. "I was struggling too," she said finally. "No one ever talks about what it's like to be the partner of someone going through something like that. It was hard for me, James. Watching you in pain every day, not knowing how to help. It was overwhelming." James tilted his head slightly. "Overwhelming?" Lisa nodded, regaining some of her composure now that she had something to hold on to. "Yes," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I know I didn't handle everything perfectly, but I was young, I was scared, and I didn't have anyone to turn to. I wasn't abandoning you, I was trying to survive too." James studied her. She was good at this, twisting things just enough to make herself seem like the victim, without outright lying. He had seen it before, the way she could shift a narrative in her favor, with just the right amount of vulnerability. And for a moment, he almost felt himself slipping back into that old mindset. The one where he second-guessed himself, where he wondered if maybe, just maybe, she had a point. But then he remembered. He remembered the nights he had spent alone in that hospital room, staring at the ceiling, waiting for a visit that never came. He remembered the day he finally came home, struggling to make it up the stairs, only for Lisa to sigh in frustration, because she just needed a break from all of this. He remembered the way she had started staying out later, making excuses, distancing herself more and more until it became painfully clear she didn't want to be around him anymore. "You weren't trying to survive, Lisa," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You were trying to escape." Lisa opened her mouth, then closed it again. She looked at Whitmore, as if hoping for guidance. But even he seemed to recognize that no carefully crafted legal defense could undo what had just happened. The judge exhaled, tapping her pen against the desk in thought. "Let's move forward," she said, her voice carrying a note of finality. "We still have financial matters and asset division to discuss." Whitmore straightened, clearly eager to steer the case back into safer territory. "Yes, Your Honor," he said. "If we could return to the topic of financial contributions." "No." The word came from James before he had even fully processed it. He felt his lawyer, Mark, turn to him in surprise. But James wasn't interested in playing by their rules anymore. The judge arched an eyebrow. "Excuse me, Mr. Carter?" James leaned forward slightly. "I'm not going to sit here and let this case be reduced to numbers on a page," he said. "This trial isn't about money. It's about the truth. And now that it's finally out there, I have nothing else to say." Mark shifted beside him. "James, we still need to." "No," James repeated, his eyes still locked on Lisa. "I'm done." For a long moment no one spoke. Then the judge nodded slowly. "Very well," she said. She turned to Lisa's side of the table. "Does the petitioner wish to continue, given the circumstances?" Lisa hesitated. For the first time in this entire process, she looked unsure of herself. Finally, she exhaled and shook her head. "No, Your Honor." Whitmore turned to her sharply. "Lisa." She shot him a look, and whatever he was about to say died in his throat. The judge nodded again. "Then I believe we can proceed with final deliberations. Court is adjourned for today." The sound of the gavel striking would echoed through the room. And just like that, it was over. James sat still for a moment as the tension slowly began to fade from his body. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face before finally standing. He could feel people watching him, spectators, clerks, even the judge herself, but he didn't care. He had said what needed to be said. Lisa was already gathering her things, moving quickly, like she couldn't wait to get out of there. As she stood, their eyes met one final time. For the first time in years, James didn't see arrogance or condescension in her expression. He saw something else. Regret. She turned away before he could say anything, walking toward the exit with Whitmore close behind her. James watched her go, knowing that whatever happened next, things would never be the same between them. And for the first time in a long time, he was okay with that. James stepped out of the courtroom into the cool afternoon air, exhaling deeply as the heavy doors closed behind him. The sounds of the city, honking cars, distant chatter, the rhythmic clack of hurried footsteps, felt strangely distant, as if he were hearing them through a layer of thick glass. For months he had been dreading this day, anticipating the humiliation, the endless questioning, the feeling of being picked apart like a case study rather than a human being. But now that it was over, he felt something unexpected. Relief. He had spent so long carrying the weight of Lisa's judgment, of the way she had reduced him to nothing more than an inconvenience, a liability. But today he had finally taken that weight and set it down. The scars on his body had always been a silent story, one he had never been given the space to tell. Today he had told it, and for the first time in years he felt lighter. His lawyer Mark stepped beside him adjusting his tie. "Well," he said, running a hand through his graying hair, "I have to admit, I wasn't expecting that. You took a big risk back there, James." James gave a small, tired smile. "Yeah," he said. "But it was worth it." Mark studied him for a moment before nodding. "Think so too." He checked his watch. "We'll get the final ruling in a few days, but given how things played out, I doubt Lisa's going to push for much more. I think she just wants this to be over." James glanced toward the courthouse doors, half expecting Lisa to walk out any second. But she didn't. Maybe she was waiting inside, trying to compose herself before facing the world again. Or maybe she was gone. Either way, it didn't matter anymore. "Thanks, Mark," James said. His lawyer clapped him on the shoulder. "Get some rest," he said. "You've earned it." With that, he walked off, disappearing into the crowd of people moving along the courthouse steps. James stood there for a moment, taking in the city around him. He had spent so much of the past few years feeling like his life was something happening to him, rather than something he was living. Every decision had been made with Lisa in mind. Her expectations, her disappointment, her judgment. Even after she had left him, he had still been living in her shadow, measuring himself against her unspoken standard of what a man should be, what a husband should be. But now, for the first time in a long time, there was nothing holding him back. He turned and started walking. James's apartment was small, a far cry from the sleek modern house he had once shared with Lisa, but it was his. It wasn't filled with designer furniture or carefully curated decor, but it was comfortable, lived in. The kind of place where he could kick off his shoes and not worry about scuffing the floors. He tossed his keys onto the kitchen counter and went straight to the fridge, pulling out a cold beer. As he twisted off the cap, he caught sight of his reflection in the window. For a moment he just stared. Lisa had always made him feel small, like he wasn't enough, like he was a shell of the man he was supposed to be. But looking at himself now, he didn't see weakness. He saw someone who had survived. Someone who had been broken, yes, but who had put himself back together piece by piece. The scars on his chest weren't signs of failure. They were proof that he was still here. He took a slow sip of his beer and turned away from the window. His phone buzzed on the counter. A text from an unknown number. "Lisa, can we talk?" James stared at the message for a long moment. Part of him had expected this. Lisa hated losing. She hated loose ends. She hated not having the last word. And yet, there was something different about this. If this had been the Lisa he had known before, she would have fought until the bitter end, trying to twist the narrative back in her favor. But she hadn't. She had given up in that courtroom. She had let him walk away. James tapped his fingers against the counter, debating whether to respond. He could. He could let her say whatever she needed to say. He could give her that final conversation, hear her out, maybe even try to find some kind of closure. But as he stood there, feeling the cool glass of the beer bottle in his hand, he realized something. He didn't need it. He had already found his closure. Not in anything Lisa could say, not in any explanation or half apology she might offer, but in the simple fact that he had finally spoken his truth. And that was enough. He locked his phone, setting it face down on the counter. Instead of dwelling on the past, he turned on the radio, letting the low hum of music fill the apartment. Then he sat down, stretched his legs out on the coffee table, and took another sip of his beer. For the first time in a long time, James Carter wasn't looking back. He was looking forward.